My son sent me a rent bill, not for a house I borrowed, not for a place I trashed, but for the home I gifted him, fully paid off, signed over, with a promise that I could live there when I couldn't live alone anymore. 5 years later, he slid a typed invoice under my door and called it fair. 3 weeks after that, I served him an eviction notice. Before we start, please make sure to like this video and hit that subscribe button so you never miss a story like this, and also comment where you're watching from. Thanks. I was pouring my morning coffee when I heard the envelope slide through the front door mail slot. I live with one ear always tuned to the mailbox now, ever since the pharmacy messed up my blood pressure meds and I missed a refill. I thought it was another appointment reminder or a flyer for lawn care. Instead, it was a plain white envelope with my name, typed. No return address. The second I opened it, my hands started shaking. It was a formal rent notice. From my son. $200 due by the 5th of the month. Occupant. Margaret Thompson. He didn't even write Mom. There was a breakdown of utilities and a line about guest privileges suspended pending payment. I read it 3 times, thinking maybe it was a mistake or some automated thing. But at the bottom, in blue ink, it was signed, Daniel Thompson. My son, my only child. The same son I gave this house to 5 years ago. I stood in the hallway, just staring at the paper, and I swear, for a full minute I forgot how to breathe. I felt something drop in my chest, like when you trip, but don't. Fall, just that stomach punch of, what the hell is happening? Daniel wasn't home when I got the letter. He works in real estate now. Flips properties, he says, like it's poker. He moved me into the guest room last year when my knees gave out and I sold the last bit of my husband's farmland. I gave him the house as a wedding gift, told him, this is yours, but when I can't live alone anymore, I get to come here. That was the deal. No lawyers, no papers, just mother and son looking each other in the eye. When I handed him the keys, he cried. He said he'd take care of me forever. That was 5 years ago. Before Kayla, before the big job, before the Tesla and the second bathroom remodel. I waited in the kitchen with the rent bill laid out like a corpse on the counter. When I heard his key in the lock, I stood up thinking maybe it was a joke. Maybe Kayla sent it, and he didn't know. Or maybe it was some weird financial thing, and he'd laugh and tear it up. But the second he saw me holding it, he looked annoyed. Not guilty, not sheepish, annoyed. I figured we should be clear. About things going forward, he said, dropping his keys on the console. Utilities have doubled. I can't carry everything. He didn't sit down, didn't ask if I'd eaten, just stood there, arms crossed, like I was some squatter. I asked him if he remembered what I said when I gave him the house. About living here when I couldn't live alone anymore. He shrugged. That was 5 years ago, Mom. Things change. You said you'd only be here temporarily. He walked past me and opened the fridge like I was invisible. You eat the same. Food I buy. You use the internet. I can't just carry a whole adult's cost on top of everything else. I asked if Kayla was behind this. He didn't answer, just kept looking through the fridge, then grabbed a LaCroix and said, Don't make this into drama. It's just rent. Everyone pays rent. I asked him if he'd be okay with me sleeping in my car. He laughed. Stop being emotional. I didn't cry in front of him. I waited until he went upstairs, then I walked back to my room, packed. A small duffel bag and left. I didn't slam the door, didn't say goodbye, just left. Drove to a Walgreens parking lot and sat there until the sun went down, staring at the rent bill, trying to figure out how the boy I raised became the man who saw me as a bill to collect. Around 8 p.m., I opened the trunk to look for a blanket and found a box I hadn't touched in years, old bank statements, medical records, and the original paperwork from when I paid off the house. Taped to the side was a smaller envelope I didn't remember placing there. It was labeled in my late husband's handwriting, House, Final Deed. I opened it, hands trembling. Inside was the full notarized deed transfer document from when I gave Daniel the house. But something caught my eye. A sticky note I must have left for myself. It said, Keep for records, may need for future proof. I stared at that note until my eyes blurred. Then I folded it all back up, sat back, in the car and thought, maybe it's not too late to fight. Maybe this house isn't just his. Maybe the boy I raised forgot who built the foundation. But I didn't. The last time I held the deed in my hand, Daniel was standing in my kitchen, dressed in a suit 2 sizes too big, hands still stained from hauling boxes. His wedding was 2 weeks away, and we were finalizing paperwork for the house. He looked nervous, almost guilty, like he couldn't believe I was actually doing it. I remember his exact words. "Mom, are you sure? This is your safety net. You don't have to do this." I told him I wanted to, that it was what his father would have done. I'd sold the last of the farmland a month before that, 30 acres. We held on to after James died. The money was just sitting in the account, and Daniel and Kayla had been scraping together savings, trying to buy a home before their lease ended. I'd watched them tour beat-up listings every weekend, come home, discouraged. So I called him one morning and said, "Let me help." It wasn't just generosity. I needed purpose. I needed to feel like I was doing something that mattered. I told myself this house would keep our family close. I told him, "This is your wedding gift. It's in your name, but when I get too old to be on my own, I come here. No arguments." He nodded, swallowed hard, then hugged me like a little boy again. He promised, "You'll always have a place with us, no matter what." At the time, I believed him. The day they moved in, I baked 2 pies and stocked the fridge before they arrived. Kayla walked in and squealed at the granite countertops. She kissed Daniel and said, "This feels like we're finally winning." That sentence stuck with me. We're finally winning. Like it was a game, like life was a scoreboard. Back then, I liked her. She was bright, sharp, knew how to make Daniel laugh when he got stuck in his own head. She didn't come from much either. Her mother passed when she was 12, and her dad worked construction jobs out of state. She seemed tough. I respected that. But even then, I noticed little things. Kayla quietly suggesting they repaint the guest room so it felt more like theirs, or how she called the living room my space in front of her friends. I brushed it off. Young people wanted their own stamp on things. I understood. I didn't push. I didn't remind them that the house came from me. I didn't even tell most of my friends about the gift. I didn't want it to look like I was trying to buy affection. I just wanted to be near my son, to be part of his new life. For the first year, things were good. We had dinners together, Sunday breakfasts, game nights. They invited me over for birthdays, asked me to dog sit when they went away. I still had my own apartment, but I kept a small bag at their house, just in case. When my arthritis flared up, Kayla would bring me heating pads. Daniel still called me twice a week, but things shifted after Kayla got the job at that design firm. Her hours stretched, her clothes changed, her friends got wealthier. Suddenly, the neighborhood didn't feel fresh enough. She started remodeling. Daniel followed her lead. New fixtures, new landscaping, new debt. He started talking about leveraging the house for investments. That was the first time I felt nervous. I asked him if he remembered what we agreed. He said, "Of course. Don't worry. It's your home too." But I felt it. A crack forming. 2 years later, when I slipped on the front steps of my own apartment and ended up in urgent care, Daniel picked me up, brought me back to their house, and said, "You'll stay with us for a while, until you heal." That's when the shift became permanent. My lease ended. I moved into their guest room. At first it was warm. Kayla helped decorate. Daniel bought me a better mattress. But then the subtle distance crept in. Kayla started locking the pantry. Daniel forgot to refill my prescriptions. They stopped inviting me to dinner with their friends. Kayla began calling me Margaret instead of Mom. And God, help me. I stayed silent. I told myself it was just stress, just temporary, just something I had to endure because that's what parents do. Until that letter came. Until Daniel looked me in the face and called me a financial burden. That night, after finding the deed and that old sticky note in my trunk, I sat in the Walgreens parking lot and thought back to the exact moment I handed over the house. I could still see Daniel's hands shaking as he signed. I could still feel the hope I had, and now all I could feel was this quiet, burning rage. Not at the money, not even at the disrespect, at the betrayal of a promise made, the kind that should have mattered more than a contract. I started the engine. I had one more place to check, my storage unit. There were things there I hadn't touched since James died. Maybe something in there could help. I didn't know what, but I knew I wasn't done. Not yet. Not by a long shot. I drove straight to the storage unit that night, running on coffee and adrenaline, the kind of wired energy that comes from humiliation and anger tangled together. The air was thick with dust the moment I pulled the roll-up door, but I knew exactly which bin to grab: blue lid, taped corners, the one marked House Docs. I dragged it into the hallway, knelt down despite my knees aching, and started digging. Old photos, the appraisal, inspection reports, even a typed note from the real estate agent congratulating me on starting a legacy for your family. It stung. I flipped past it, desperate to find anything: emails, maybe something Kayla signed, anything linking her to the agreement. Nothing. My hands were trembling when I shut the bin, and my body hurt in places I forgot could hurt. I sat there for a long time, just breathing in the smell of cardboard and dry air, until a thought hit me like a gut punch. Kayla had never signed anything because she'd never needed to. Daniel handled all the documents, but Kayla was in the room. She was there when I gave him the house. And if there was any truth to what I was starting to believe, that this rent letter wasn't some spontaneous decision but part of a plan, then she would have left fingerprints somewhere. The next morning, I pretended nothing happened. I went back to the house while Daniel was at work. Kayla was home alone, barefoot, in yoga pants, walking around with her phone in one hand and a clipboard in the other. She didn't hear me come in at first. She was in the kitchen taking photos, repositioning a vase, muttering things like natural light pop and farmhouse modern blend. I watched for a second, then asked, "What are you doing?" She jumped a little, then turned and smiled like she'd been caught doing something adorable. "Oh, hey, Margaret, just staging for some Airbnb pics. Nothing crazy." I asked, "You're renting the house out?" She said, "Just a room. It's no big deal." But it wasn't just a room. I looked past her into the living room and saw price tags on throw pillows, brochures from a short-term rental site, and a checklist of maintenance. Repairs, new caulking, carpet cleaning, a chimney inspection. That wasn't a room rental. That was a property flip. I didn't ask permission. I walked straight down the hall to the guest room, my room, and opened the door. Half the furniture was gone. My books, my blanket, even the painting of James. And I, from our wedding day, was missing. I turned back around and asked her, "What is this?" She didn't blink. She said, "We figured you'd be moving on soon. Daniel and I talked. He said you were thinking of finding your own space." My throat clenched. I said, "That's not what I said." She crossed her arms, cool as ice. "Well, either way, we need the income. It's nothing personal." I pulled out my phone then and hit record. She noticed, and her tone shifted, but not enough. She said, "Look, it's not like you're being kicked out. We're just formalizing things. If you pay rent, you can stay. But otherwise, yeah, we need to open up the room." I asked her, "Was this your idea?" She didn't answer, just raised one eyebrow like she was waiting for me to get over it. I kept recording, kept my voice calm. I said, "Daniel promised me I'd live here for the rest of my life. That was the agreement." She rolled her eyes. "There was no contract, Margaret. It was a gift. Gifts don't come with strings." That was the moment I realized she wasn't some innocent bystander. She was orchestrating this. Maybe not alone, but enough to turn Daniel into someone who saw me as a cost. She smiled then, fake and tight, and said, "We just figured you wouldn't fight it, that you'd be reasonable." I ended the recording there, walked out without saying another word. I drove to the library parking lot, connected to the free Wi-Fi, and emailed the file to myself, then to the lawyer. I didn't even listen to it. I just knew. That was the proof I needed. And for the first time since all this began, I didn't feel powerless. I felt like something was shifting, like I wasn't going to be erased quietly. The next morning, I sat in the lawyer's office with my purse clutched in both hands, like it was the only solid thing holding me together. His name was Michael Crane, mid-40s, tie loosened, half-finished coffee on his desk. He came recommended by Marcia, a friend from my church, who said he helped her daughter get out of a terrible lease with an ex-boyfriend. I didn't know what to expect, but I had the email with the recording queued on my phone, the deed copy in my bag, and every scrap of paper I could find about the house printed and stuffed into a manila folder. I didn't speak until he did. He skimmed through my documents first, quiet and unreadable, then leaned back and asked, "You're telling me you gave your son the house as a gift, but under an informal condition that you could live there for life?" I nodded. He tapped his pen twice on the folder, then said, "And now he's trying to evict you by charging rent, correct?" I told him yes. I told him everything. About the letter, about the cold way Daniel spoke to me, about the Airbnb, about the missing wedding photo. I could feel my voice cracking, but I held it together. Then I played him the recording. He didn't react much, just leaned in and listened, face steady. When it ended, he asked, "Did you inform her you were recording?" I shook my head no, but I told him it was in my own house, and he nodded, said it was probably fine in our state, but we'd double-check. He sat back, thoughtful. "It's not a slam-dunk case, Margaret. But this? It's definitely leverage. If we can show that the gift was conditional, even just morally, and that there was a long-standing understanding of cohabitation, there's a chance we can argue constructive trust or even undue influence, especially if we show you were vulnerable when the transfer happened." I didn't know half the legal words he used, but I understood enough. There was a chance. I asked him what it would cost. He looked me in the eye and said, "I'll be honest, it's not cheap. But if you win, you could reclaim partial ownership or at least secure a permanent residence clause. If you lose, you'll likely be out for good." I asked him what he really thought, not the professional version, the honest one. He paused, then said, "I think your son's behavior is going to disgust a jury, but we need more. Right now, it's your word and a vague audio clip. If we could find something from when the house was first given, anything in writing that references your lifetime stay, we'd have a real shot." I left his office feeling the same as I did walking out of the hospital the day James died. Numb but focused, like my body knew what to do even if my brain hadn't caught up. I drove home slowly, every block blurring into the next, until I pulled up to the house and stared at it from the street. It didn't even look like home anymore. The shutters were painted black now. The roses James planted were gone. Kayla's Range Rover was in the driveway. I didn't go inside. I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, thinking back. 5 years ago, the living room, the moment I handed Daniel the deed. I remembered James's voice in my head, from a recording. "We used to play for Daniel when he was young. A promise is stronger than paper." I couldn't stop thinking about the shed. Not the part they remodeled, but the old one. The one behind the garage that Daniel never used. James kept everything in there. Tools, tax boxes, old files from when he ran the co-op. He once told me he left something important in there, just in case anything happened to him. I always thought he meant a will, but maybe it was more. I turned the car around and drove to the back alley. There was a gap in the fence where the wood had rotted. I parked behind it, climbed through with effort, and made my way to the shed. The lock was rusty, but it popped open with a little force. Inside, it smelled like motor oil and dust. I turned on my phone flashlight and scanned the shelves. Then, tucked behind an old gas can, I saw it, a black metal box with a handle. My heart pounded. I pulled it down, set it on the ground, and opened it. Inside were old property documents, a few handwritten letters, and a folder labeled Maggie, just in case. My fingers went cold. I opened it. There was a letter from James, dated the year before he passed, and a draft of a contract outlining our plan to give Daniel the house under one condition: lifetime co-residency for me, non-revocable, unless voluntarily vacated. It wasn't signed, but it existed, and James's handwriting was unmistakable. I sat on the shed floor with the letter in my lap, tears blurring my vision, and I whispered out loud, "Thank you, James. Thank you for thinking ahead." Then, I stood up, wiped my face, and walked back to the car with the box clutched to my chest like it was my lifeline. Because in a way, it was. The next morning, I was back in Michael's office before he even finished his first cup of coffee. I didn't call ahead. I didn't care. I walked in with the black box pressed against my ribs like I was carrying an organ, something vital that could die if I let go. His assistant tried to stop me, but the look on my face must have said enough. He came out from his office, took one look at me, then waved me in. I sat down, placed the box gently on his desk, and opened it. I slid the draft letter forward. "Read this," I said. He didn't ask questions. He adjusted his glasses, took a long look at the letter from James, then the draft contract. His expression didn't change much, but his eyes did. Focused, sharper. This helps," he said slowly. "It's not signed, but it's dated, and it clearly outlines the condition tied to the gift. And coming from your husband? It shows intent. That's key." I told him about the box, the shed, everything James ever said about just in case. Michael nodded slowly, turning pages with care like they were made of tissue. "We can argue this letter reflects the original agreement, that the house was never meant to be an unconditional gift. Between this and the recording from Kayla, we have a narrative, and juries respond to narrative, especially when it involves betrayal." I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Hope, not certainty, but enough to make me sit a little straighter in the chair. He leaned back, tapping, his pen again. "We'll file a petition to establish a constructive trust, citing undue influence and breach of oral agreement. It won't be fast. Daniel will fight back. He'll try to discredit you. But we can frame this as a case of elder abuse, financial and emotional manipulation." That word stuck in my chest. Abuse. I'd never thought of it like that. But it was. Not with fists or shouting, but with distance, control, and silence. I left the office feeling like the fog had lifted just a little. For the first time since the rent letter came, I didn't feel like I was drowning. I felt like I had a compass. I drove straight to the grocery store and bought a rotisserie chicken, not because I was hungry, but because I wanted to do something. Ordinary, something that reminded me I was still a person, not just a problem to be solved. Back at my temporary apartment, I sat down at the table and reread the letter from James 3 times. He wrote in his usual blunt way. No frills, just facts. But I could feel his love in every line. "If anything happens to me, Maggie stays. This house was bought from farmland money. She earned every plank and nail." I thought about how proud he was of that land, how he worked his hands raw every spring to keep it going, how he died thinking he was giving Daniel a foundation, not a weapon. I called Marcia that night and told her everything. She listened without interrupting once, then said, "You're not crazy, Maggie. You're brave." I didn't feel brave. I felt tired, but I knew I couldn't stop now. Michael called the next day and said he filed the paperwork. Daniel would be served within a week. He warned me again it would get uglier before it got better, and he was right. 2 days later, I got a text from Daniel. Just one line. "I can't believe you're doing this to your own son." No apology. No explanation. Just blame. I stared at it for 5 minutes before deleting it. No response. No reaction. I didn't owe him that anymore. I was done playing the quiet mother. Done swallowing humiliation for the sake of keeping peace. I'd kept my promise. I gave him the house. I stayed quiet when they remodeled my bedroom. I said nothing when Kayla erased every trace of me. But this was where I drew the line. I stared out the window at the cheap apartment view and whispered to myself, "You picked this fight, Daniel. Let's see how you like losing." 5 days after Daniel was served, I got a call from an unknown number and let it go to voicemail. When I listened to it later, it was Daniel. His voice was calm, careful, like he was reading a script. "Mom, I think this has gone too far. Let's talk. No lawyers, just you and me. Kayla and I want to meet you at the mediation center on Wednesday. See if we can find a compromise. You don't need to fight. We can fix this." For a split second, a part of me, the part that still remembered rocking him through ear infections and writing notes in his lunchbox, wanted to believe he meant it. But the way he said, "fix this," didn't sound like love. It sounded like damage control. I forwarded the voicemail to Michael. He called me back within minutes. "You don't have to go. This isn't court mandated, and frankly, they're likely trying to get you to say something they can use against you." I asked him what he would do. He was quiet for a second, then said, "If you go, don't go alone. I'll come with you. And don't sign a single thing, not even a check-in form. Just listen. Let them talk. That'll tell us everything." So I agreed. The mediation center was one of those gray office buildings in a strip mall, the kind that always smells like air freshener and toner. I got there 10 minutes early, sat in the parking lot staring at the entrance, trying to settle the pit in. My stomach. Michael showed up right on time. He walked me in like a shield, calm and quiet, and we sat at the long table across from Daniel and Kayla. They were dressed sharp, too sharp for something casual. Kayla had a leather portfolio and Daniel kept tapping a pen like he was bored already. The mediator introduced herself, started the clock, and asked each side to share their position. Michael deferred to Daniel. He leaned forward and said, "Look, I think we've all been a little emotional. My mom misunderstood our intentions. We weren't trying to kick her out, just trying to be fair. We didn't expect this to escalate. To court." He glanced at Kayla, then back at me. "We want to offer a buyout. If she agrees to formally vacate and withdraw the claim, we're willing to give her $30,000. That's more than generous considering the house was a gift." I stared at him. $30,000. For a home built on my husband's land, paid with the money I bled for my promise, my trust, my pride. Before I could speak, Michael leaned in and asked, "What happens if she refuses?" Daniel blinked. "Then we let the courts decide. But it'll get messy, no one wins." Kayla added, "And Airbnb's already booked out through next quarter. We're trying to keep things stable." That's when I realized this wasn't about resolution. This was about business. They didn't want peace. They wanted me gone before it impacted their income stream. Michael asked them directly, "Is the property currently listed for sale or active rental?" Kayla hesitated. Daniel said no, but Michael pulled out a printed listing from a short-term rental site. Photos taken just days earlier with timestamps. "You're lying to the mediator. That undermines the process." The mediator looked uncomfortable but noted it. Daniel got defensive. "This is harassment. She's using my father's death to manipulate the system." I opened my mouth, but Michael squeezed my wrist gently. "Don't respond," he whispered. "Let them implode." Kayla started flipping pages in her folder, looking for something to pivot with, but it was too late. The mediator stopped the session early. "I recommend continuing this in court. The trust here is clearly broken." On the way out, Daniel tried to follow me into the hallway. "Mom, come on. We can fix this. We're family." I turned to him and said, as quietly as I could without shaking, "No, Daniel. You're not family. You're someone who used that word to get free real estate." Then I walked out into the sun, head high, heart pounding, and finally, feeling like the storm was turning in my favor. After the failed mediation, everything started moving faster. Court dates were being set, Daniel's lawyer filed a motion to dismiss, and Michael told me to expect character attacks. "They'll dig up anything," he warned. Finances, medical, records, even family history. I told him I had nothing to hide, but deep down, I knew there were pieces of the past I'd kept tucked away, not out of shame, but because I thought they didn't matter anymore. That changed when a letter arrived from the court requesting identity verification documents and anything related to Daniel's birth and adoption. The word hit me like a freight train. Adoption. I sat on the couch for a full minute, holding the paper, unable to breathe. It had been decades since I thought about the legal side of it. Daniel never knew. James and I never told him. He was just barely 2 when I married James, and his biological mother, James's ex, had given up custody without a fight. She'd signed the papers and vanished, and I became Daniel's legal mother before he even knew what the word meant. He'd called me Mom since he could speak. I never wanted him to feel different or abandoned. He was mine. In every real way, he was mine. But now that detail was coming back like a ghost I thought had long been buried. I called Michael. His voice was calm, but I could hear the shift. This could work both ways. They might try to argue you had no legal reason to make long-term claims on the house since you're not blood. But if we frame it right, it shows something better. You raised him without obligation. You loved him enough to give him a home, name, and legacy that weren't biologically yours. I asked, "Will the court care about that?" He said, "Juries care about love, Maggie. We just have to show them what it cost you." That night, I pulled out an old photo album I hadn't touched in years. Inside were pictures of Daniel at 3, at 6, at 12, birthday cakes, scraped knees, school projects. All the things that don't show up in legal documents but mean more than any court filing ever could. There was one photo I stopped on. Me holding Daniel in my lap, his arms around my neck, and James in the background, blurry but smiling. I remembered the day perfectly. It was the first time Daniel called me Mommy in public. We were at a zoo. He pointed at a lion and then looked at me and said, "Mommy, he's got a loud mouth like you." I laughed so hard I cried. James told me later that night, "He doesn't know anything else. You're his whole world now." The next morning, Michael asked me to bring any documentation of the adoption. Court records, name changes, anything. Official. I dug through my storage box again, the one I'd brought from the shed, and found a manila envelope tucked between tax files. Inside were the adoption records, signed and sealed. There was also a note James had written the day we filed. The paperwork. It said, "We do this today because love is more than DNA. Maggie's already his mother. This is just paperwork catching up." I took the documents to Michael and watched him scan through them slowly. "This changes the framing," he said. "If we introduce this, we show the jury that you gave your life to this boy. Without legal pressure, without obligation. You didn't just give him a house, you gave him everything." I nodded, but my heart was heavy. I knew Daniel didn't know about the adoption, and I hated that it might come out in court, in front of strangers, in a way that felt like a weapon. But he'd left me no choice. That week, Daniel's lawyer sent over another letter, this time demanding that I vacate the house within 30 days, or they'd escalate to a formal restraining order. I forwarded it to Michael without even reading the last paragraph. The gloves were off now. Daniel wanted war, and I had one final thing to remind him. I might not be his biological mother, but I was the only one who ever stayed, and now I was done staying silent. The morning of the court hearing, I woke up before the sun, sat on the edge of the bed in my small apartment, and stared at the wall for a long time. It felt like the silence before a storm, not outside, but inside my chest. I got dressed slowly, choosing the navy blue blouse James always said made me look steady, trustworthy, like someone who gets things done. I pinned my hair up, kept my makeup minimal, and made sure every single document was packed neatly in my bag, organized by date, tabbed by Michael's paralegal the night before. When we arrived at the courthouse, I felt like my skin didn't quite fit, like I was moving in a dream where nothing was familiar, but everything mattered. Michael walked beside me, calm as always, briefcase in hand, nodding to other lawyers in the hall like this was just another day. For me, it felt like the culmination of every moment I had ever doubted myself, every time I told myself to stay quiet, to keep the peace, to be the bigger person. The courtroom wasn't large, but it was cold and bright, and Daniel sat across from me with his arms folded, wearing a charcoal suit and a smirk I hadn't seen since he was a teenager trying to talk his way out of a speeding ticket. Kayla sat beside him, avoiding my eyes, flipping through her phone until the bailiff told her to put it away. The judge entered, a woman in her 60s, sharp-eyed and unsmiling. She called the case, and everything began. Michael laid out our position first, how the house had been transferred with a verbal agreement attached, how I had moved in under that agreement, and how Daniel had violated the understanding by attempting to charge rent and evict me. He introduced the shed letter from James, the audio recording from Kayla, and the adoption records, all marked and submitted as exhibits. Then he read James's words aloud, and for a moment the courtroom felt still in a different way, not tense, but moved. Daniel's lawyer tried to object, saying the documents weren't legally binding, that they were sentimental at best, hearsay at worst. The judge overruled her. When it was Daniel's turn, he spoke carefully, choosing every A word like it was pre-written. He said he appreciated what I had done, but that he never agreed to a lifetime arrangement, that I had been welcome as a guest, not a resident, that my presence had begun to affect his marriage and his financial stability. He never once looked directly at me. When his lawyer tried to argue that as an adopted child I held no legal claim to familial assets, Michael stood and calmly destroyed the point with precedents, citing at least 3 similar cases where adoptive relationships were honored fully by the court. Then came the most unexpected part. Michael had subpoenaed Kayla to testify. She looked caught off guard, but composed herself and took the stand. She tried to keep it neutral at first, but under questioning, her tone cracked. She admitted that, yes, I had given them the house. Yes, Daniel had told her from the beginning that I would live with them someday. Yes, they'd planned the rent letter together as a way to push me out. It wasn't meant to be cruel, she said, her voice wobbling. We just didn't think she'd fight back. That sentence stayed in my head like an echo. We didn't think she'd fight back. The judge listened without expression, then looked directly at Daniel and said, "It appears that your actions reflect a significant breach of trust and moral obligation. Whether or not a contract existed in ink, the evidence strongly suggests that a binding verbal agreement and family promise were made and later disregarded. That carries weight." She announced that she would issue her formal ruling in 72 hours and warned both parties to refrain from any retaliatory actions in the meantime. As we stood to leave, Daniel tried to say something, but the bailiff was already guiding us out. I didn't need to hear whatever rehearsed apology he'd finally cooked up. I didn't need to be soothed. I needed to breathe. Outside the courtroom, I stood under the sharp white sky and felt every ounce of pain, humiliation, and buried heartbreak start to loosen its grip. I wasn't whole yet. I wasn't done. But I was no longer invisible. I was heard. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like a burden. I felt like a person reclaiming her ground. The 72 hours crawled by like time had thickened, like every second wanted to make me question if I'd done the right thing, if I had gone too far, if some part of this would come back to punish me worse than the silence I used to live in. I barely slept. I didn't leave my apartment. I played old recordings of James reading to Daniel when he was little, soft cassette tapes I hadn't touched in over a decade, just to remind myself of what love used to sound like in our house. When the court clerk called to confirm the verdict had been filed and that both parties were required to attend the reading, I got dressed like I was walking into a baptism and a funeral at the same time. I wore the same blouse I wore to James's memorial, pale gray, with sleeves that covered my arms, because I felt like every inch of me had been on display too long already. The courtroom was quiet when we arrived. No jury this time, just the judge, her gavel already placed on the bench like punctuation, waiting for a sentence to end. Michael sat beside me, steady, composed. Daniel and Kayla walked in late, Daniel in the same suit he wore last time, Kayla in oversized sunglasses like she thought this was press-worthy. The judge wasted no time. She reviewed the facts aloud. How? The property was gifted without formal legal conditions, but with a clearly established verbal agreement, evidenced by testimony, letters, recordings, and behavior over multiple years. She noted the adoption history and emphasized that under the law, there was no difference between adopted and biological parental relationships in matters of gift intent and family duty. She said the attempt to charge rent was not only ethically troubling, but under the circumstances, constituted an abuse of familial trust and appeared to be a strategy to force an eviction through pressure and control. Then she ruled. She ordered that I be granted a permanent life estate in the property, which meant I could live there for the rest of my life without rent or interference. Daniel retained legal ownership, but was barred from selling, refinancing, or profiting from the home while I was alive and residing in it. She also ordered Daniel and Kayla to pay court fees and issue a written apology, noting that while not enforceable as a moral remedy, it would serve the record. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just sat there, letting the words wash over me, heavy and clear like the last rain before spring. Daniel stood there frozen, jaw tight, fists clenched. He didn't speak. Kayla looked down, the sunglasses now off, her face pale. Michael leaned toward me and whispered, "It's over. You won." But it didn't feel like winning. It felt like breathing again after years underwater. Outside, Daniel tried to approach me. He said my name once, not Mom, just Margaret. I turned and looked at him, and for the first time, I didn't see my son. I saw a stranger who had worn my love like a coat and tossed it away when it got too warm. I said nothing, just walked past him, down the courthouse steps, back into the world with my spine straighter than it had been in years. I returned to the house the next morning. It was quiet, almost too quiet, like it was holding its breath. Daniel's things were gone. Kayla's car wasn't in the driveway. I walked inside with just one small suitcase, set it down in the guest room, and then did something I hadn't done in months. I sat on the couch, took off my shoes, and turned on the radio. There was no tension in the walls, no sharp edges, just me in my home, exactly where I said I'd be when I couldn't live alone anymore. Later that night, I found a plastic bin in the back of the closet. Inside were Daniel's old baby books, a Father's Day card he'd made for James in Nien, kindergarten, and a small camcorder we used to use before phones got smart. I powered it on, mostly out of curiosity. The last video was labeled Guest Room, Jan. I clicked play. The screen lit up. It was my room. But what I saw made my stomach twist. There was a blinking red light in the corner, mounted just above the closet. A hidden camera. The date matched the week the rent letter was sent. My heart pounded. I rewound the tape and fast-forwarded through footage, my hands shaking, until I saw myself folding laundry, taking medication, reading in bed. All of it. Recorded. I turned off the camcorder, sat back, and stared at the wall for what felt like hours. I wasn't just unwanted. I was being watched. Every step, every sigh, every moment of private sorrow documented by the people I gave. Everything to. And in that moment, I knew, for all I'd just won, the true damage ran deeper than property. It was trust, and that would take far longer to rebuild. I didn't tell anyone about the camera at first. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to march straight to the police and press charges, but after everything, after the courtroom, the letters, the silence, I knew the damage wasn't about legality anymore. It was about what happens when trust rots quietly in the walls of a home you once built out of love. I removed the camera myself. It was wired into a portable power pack and Wi-Fi hub, probably something Kayla picked up online, and it had been running for weeks. I boxed it all up, labeled it, and placed it in a locked drawer in the office in case I ever needed it again. Then I took the camcorder, the bin of baby memories, and everything that used to make me cry when I looked at it, and I stored it in the attic. Not thrown out, not destroyed, just stored, because I wasn't erasing my past. I was stepping out of it. Over the next few weeks, I began living in the house like it belonged to me again. Not out of defiance, not out of spite, but because for the first time in years, I felt like I didn't have to shrink myself to fit in someone else's story. I rearranged the furniture in the living room, donated the cold modern decor Kayla left behind, and brought in warm colors, real plants, hand-woven blankets. I kept James's favorite chair and had it reupholstered in dark blue like it used to be. I repainted the kitchen cabinets with the help of Marcia and two of her friends from church. I even reopened the back porch James had closed up years ago and turned it into a small reading space with a rocking chair and wind chimes. Slowly, the house started to feel alive again, not just structurally, but emotionally. I didn't hear from Daniel for weeks. No calls, no letters, not even the court-mandated apology. I heard through someone at church that he and Kayla had split up, that she moved out and took her name off the Airbnb business. Apparently, he tried to start another one in a different city, but it didn't take. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt a deep, slow sadness, the kind that comes from understanding too late that the child you loved never really saw you as more than what you gave him. But I didn't dwell. I didn't wait for closure. I made my own. I started small. I began attending a local support group for older women dealing with financial and emotional abuse from family. At first, I just listened. Then I shared. Then I hosted. Before long, I opened up the living room twice a week for what we now call the front room circle, a safe space for women like me to talk without judgment, without shame. I had the locks changed. I replaced the mailbox. I installed security cameras of my own, not hidden, just visible enough to make it clear that the house was mine and safe and not a place to be trespassed emotionally or otherwise. One morning, I stood in the kitchen pouring coffee when the sun hit the counter just right, and for the first time since James passed, I didn't feel like I was surviving. I felt like I was living, fully, authentically, on my terms. And in that quiet moment, I realized something. I hadn't lost a son. I had shed a stranger who once wore the face of my child. A few weeks later, a journalist from a local paper, who heard about the court case through public records, reached out. She asked to interview me for a story about elder rights, housing exploitation, and the hidden emotional cost of intergenerational entitlement. I agreed. She sat with me in the living room, asked gentle questions, and when she asked how I wanted to be quoted, I gave her the only line that truly mattered. I said, "I raised a man. I evicted a stranger. There's a difference." That story went modestly viral. Other women reached out. I got letters, emails, even donations. And just like that, the house stopped being the place where I was betrayed. It became the place where I rebuilt myself. Not because I won in court, but because I remembered who I was before the silence, before the compromise, before I let someone else decide what I was worth. This house wasn't a gift to Daniel. It was always meant to be a legacy, and I finally started living like I deserved to keep it.